Hello everyone, today we talk about Byzantine tactics between the 11th and the 13th century. We will mostly focus on, say, the Crusading era as a general period that obviously overlaps with this chronology, but that is all the more relevant considering the Byzantine position in between the Frankish, the Arab, the Turkic, and more military cultures, and that we tend to know mostly through usually treatises about warfare that the Byzantines were sort of traditionally famous to, but that not always mirror the actual military practice on the battlefield, right? And this is an issue that can be fixed only by studying battle after battle and not really leaving these treatises behind, but always recognizing that, especially in the Byzantine literary tradition, there was a much greater emphasis on the theoretical, sort of ideal side of the story that was in turn inspired to certain specific canons and models that were in turn to be interpreted into Byzantine symbolism and culture. That can really be misleading. There is this tendency that I actually denounce even for the modern era, right? But that exists historiographically about the Middle Ages as well. That is considering military treatises before essentially von Clausewitz at the beginning of the 19th century as something that would substantially inform the actual military practice. This is not the case, and it is especially not the case in the Middle Ages, right? I could digress here in explaining why, in fact, everybody would mostly be trained and would acquire experience in military matters as a commander, as a soldier, just through direct practice rather than else. We could also, of course, discuss the mostly literary importance of military treatises that were, however, a sort of divertissement, were essentially a refinement, theoretical framing of a military practice that was just so much more deeply lived, especially in a time that literally did not require, had an art of war that did not require this sort of standardized theoretical approach for anything that even today would stop to mere support of actual practical experience and gained like through direct command, and in fact not having anything to do with, I don't know, just training somebody for war and then just pretending that the military experience is something secondary or simply led by that kind of warfare. I could even digress on the weird flourishing of institutes called, like, I don't know, strategic culture, whatever. They talk about this sort of weird, I don't know, either politological or communication-based, historical, all these kind of weird mixes that have actually nothing to do with the only element that truthfully has any relevance from in a preparatory fashion concerning future command effectiveness, that is the art of war, that in turn is the diachronic and comparative study of strategies, tactics, armaments across history that you can achieve exclusively through essentially the study of every, and the reconstruction specifically from your side of entire campaigns and battles on the basis of all the sources available that most people do not even understand what it actually means. And let's be honest, we do not live in a world, we really never lived in a world in which people really have any idea of what strategic education means. People fundamentally do not understand politics, first of all. Secondly, they cannot, as a consequence, Clausewitzianly speaking, understanding war, right? The general level of education, information, of background is completely futile today for the purpose of any kind of, not even strategical culture, but military historical understanding, right? Let's properly be honest. It's not about reading a bunch of books or acting as if, you have this weird mix of like of interest towards, I don't know, arms or whatever, that will make you strategically intelligent or even more capable. This is something that requires a lifetime of work, right? And is also, of course, subordinated in the actual capacity of command to actual command experience. And I'm not talking, I don't know, NCOs. I'm talking very high levels of, like, sometimes the military properly does not they're not trained to understand warfare, right? Fighting warfare, understanding warfare, two very different things. And if anything, they collimate only at the top levels, the elite ones. But of course, in an age of populism and of, in fact, a rapid acceleration towards the individual collapse from any trace of the moral and, personal and cultural quality point of view, this is completely beyond what most people can do, including tradition, right, and understanding the the true meaning, right, of the imperial Catholic one especially. But skipping this aspect, let's deal with this topic, because again, history is about sources, but unfortunately, with Byzantine history, it's actually difficult to get down to the actual most common experience. For the West, we have a lot down the line. Latin Germanic historiography was much more limpid, fluid, clear. The Byzantines wrote in an oligarchic context, devoid of any specific interest or care or purpose towards the actual objective real representation of the world. They literally did not care. This is what Byzantine culture is in its fundamental essence, right? It would have been an insult, a denial of their own selves if they had done anything different than this. That's why you shouldn't take this seriously. And if you do, it's because you simply do not have, also in this case, any background in Byzantine history, literature, culture, and beyond. In any case, again, we do know military history also from other sources. I made last year now a video about the Battle of Dyrrhachium that is quite interesting because it shows like this Western and Byzantine military cultural meeting, so to say. This was a sort of Hastings of the Balkans, also because of the large amount of Anglo-Norse forces from the Byzantine side. As you know, it did not really end well for them. The Siculo-Normans really steamrolled them. And this we could observe because, again, it all passes through the study of campaigns and battles that we have, even though we have done more probably than any other channel in this, at least also in the general military historical analysis of the war, we have but begun. And in that case, we highlighted the main differences between the Frankish and the Byzantine model. Essentially, the latter had gradually given way to a sort of steppe influence, which still, of course, did not alter the sedentary core of the army, but fundamentally made it ever more dependent on private oligarchic means that the imperial household was reliant on. They were essentially in the Comnenian era, because that's what we're mostly covering today. There's just a few Okeyaka, great oligarchic houses that held basically the entire empire, and a great power stemming, if anything, from this mastodontic Constantinople that had absorbed basically any other community's autonomy in the empire, and that could spend, at least from this central position, a lot of money, a lot of wealth, because of its strategic location, because they control mostly of the Aegean coastline that since Hellenic times was really the core of what would become, in fact, the Byzantine world. They did not give a damn about the hinterland, if not in a sense, in an exploitative sense, and just to counter different peoples that would instead expand from that direction. And as such, they could hire, this time in history, lots of troops. And the sort of most cost benefits effective in an empire that was not faring too well from an economical point of view anyway, from the Pontic steppe. We're talking mostly about Turks and horse archers at large, right? These were, as you know, not particularly effective in an individual sense. Like the Byzantines would bring in the sort of the heavies, right? The decisive element. For the rest, they could be surrounded by these swarms of horse archers that, by definition, are not decisive because they are light troops. And this is, in fact, the same, as we'll see now, the same evidence of Frankish and Byzantine success against the same Turks, that, however, still is meant to connect with, in fact, a heavy element and combine tactics, because all these peoples, of course, any people would fight in this way. Or a combination of heavy and light, and essentially of melee and missile, respectively. And the reason why these troops were so effective compared to others, you could say, well, they could hire, I don't know, bulkier forces. They would do that at the beginning of the period, and throughout still there were, I don't know, the Varangians, there were heavy infantry mostly. There would be other, including the same Latins, the same Frankish Latin Germanic troops that would in fact create the greatest problems to the Byzantines. Like the Seljuks were a joke compared to the Siculo-Normans, for example, in terms of literal, existential threat to the empire. That in fact the Byzantines will, especially under the enlightened Manuel Comnenus, try to sort of imitate the model of meeting, however, mostly from the imperial side, meeting, of course, a great resistance from the side of the Byzantine establishment that was traditionally xenophobic and very much, again, sclerotized on its own cultural foundation. We know also how things went in the 13th century. In any case, here we look at mostly like the Byzantine statal army, so in any case, the imperial forces, right? Not what we have also had the opportunity of observing being the remnants of Byzantine power after the Fourth Crusade and, in fact, the Latin sack of Constantinople. And again, the reason why, however, at least from a numerical point of view, those Turkic horse archery was preferred was their expandability. There were many. There was always the umpteenth steppe people that would provide these guys in a way or another, also without much of a mediation need between Constantinople and whichever political center these guys could have, which also meant that the Byzantines could habitually throw these guys against one another. They could ravage, they were good raiders, whatever, but at the same time, they were alone, not particularly threatening. Again, they're a bunch of light forces. They may gradually, on the longer run, erode the empire, right? Could damage, like that we've seen how steppes, waves, invasions had historically damaged Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and even the Caucasus, even Anatolia to a degree. And so the Constantinople had been this bulwark historically for most of these forces, exactly because there wasn't much that these could do against, say, the Theodosian walls of any other sort of sedentary center expressing this, in fact, European civilization that remain a cornerstone, especially compared to the surrounding ones in the east, right? So these troops were not seriously threatening the same Byzantine strategic balance. They were easier to upkeep. They didn't really need much. Occasionally, they could simply even settle within the empire, becoming new manpower and labor force, which is in part what these guys really wanted, considering the nightmarish experience of living in the steppes to begin with. So there were some pros and cons that balanced themselves out in a discrete way from the Byzantine perspective. Now, all this especially like the increasing use of foreign mercenaries is a prerogative almost of the Comnenian era, right? We made multiple videos analyzing the pretty tragic situation in which the empire burst at the time of the rise of Alexios I, that literally had to, as equilibristically, to keep the empire together by literally throwing all these various foreign peoples against one another, to especially stem again the Norman invasion of the empire, having been beaten at Dyrrhachium and generally speaking suffering other reversals. Most of the times these forces would face in open field, and managing to preserve the main, again, cornerstones of the empire, Constantinople and part Thessaloniki, but needing evidently to rearrange in this time in history the empire from a very different in a very different way compared to the sort of post-Roman statal, say, permanent armed forces drawn from local levies of peasant soldiers, Byzantine subjects that had traditionally, historically, made up like the forces of Constantinople. This was already evident in the late Macedonian era, that witnessed this high degree of civil collapse, gradual erosion of fundamental, usurpation of power from the oligarchic system, like a collapse in public authority. So all the worst things that can happen to a civilization. And that brought, again, to this further privatization of the system from the same imperial direction that decided also to bail out of most sort of provincial defense, per se, and just concentrating on this strong central inner bulk with the resources that could be scrapped together in front of these major crises, and trying to attract, right, to bribe, to co-opt these various elements from the surrounding system, putting them together, and mostly ending up, in fact, to use these cheaper elements, which now were not capable, essentially, to match the much more bulky and orderly system that was forming in Western Europe, due to this paradox that feudal culture was so entrenched in there that, in spite of the sort of initial shortcomings in public organization, military, say, defense, and so on, was so glued together in this system that began to produce feudal states that could provide, in fact, with this very strong, sort of ever more orderly forces, including the ones that you see passing by Constantinople during the Crusades, ending up to take over the same capital of the Byzantine Empire. I talk so often about the incredibly disproportionate popular misrepresentation of this sort of, the Byzantine world in hyper, civilized, developed ways compared to the West, right? People like it in general because it makes you feel as if in the West we're more instinctive and free individuals with no regulation or half barbarian, whatever. Actually, the real civilization, real public power, real statal strength was really pioneered by us. These Eastern systems, the Islamic ones as well, were heavily deteriorated and deteriorating from a public point of view, and especially by the 13th century, Western Europe macroscopically overwhelms all these cultures, right? The entire European continent and the entire Mediterranean are in the hands, politically, socially, culturally, of Western Europe, right? And this is probably we should picture this. Like, even when you go to school, somebody should tell you, because it's something so big that, aside from the myths about the darkness of the Middle Ages, etc., there are very specific reasons why they don't want you to know it, right? And the Byzantine Empire, including its military, do not really figure so favorably as a whole. Naturally, it wasn't much of a scalar difference from Western Europe. Mostly we're looking at moral forces, but also from a technical standpoint, as you know, Frankish cavalry charges, Italian naval engineering. We're looking at this point, at least from the 12th century, more advanced systems than the Byzantine ones, on which, in fact, the same Byzantine military becomes overly dependent on. Right? This is also the ABC of Byzantine manualistic history. By the 12th century, the Byzantine Empire fights largely with Latin knights, with Italian fleets, and this remains a constant also in the later times, when, after the Fourth Crusade and also the Byzantine reconquest of Constantinople, and it remains really true in the later Middle Ages, and up to the Ottoman conquest. So this was an issue, right? The Byzantines understood it. They weren't dumb. They just were paying for a series of cultural and governmental shortcomings that really were inherent in their to their system, and that we could write, of course, oceans of ink, but we have just this much time for a single video. All right, a great figure. I really like Manuel Comnenus. Really, I'm biased towards him. Made multiple videos about his reign. I had part of the reason I had the luck of having an exam during my master degree studies about him, from mostly the work of Paul Magdalena, who is, again, wrote one of his most famous biographies. And it's really an interesting era where we do find the same, again, historiographical limitations of other times, but also a moment of great fluidity, great expansion of the system. Like, the Byzantines have all these problems in relative terms with their neighbors, right? In terms of power ratios, they've never been struggling so much. Not even in at the time of the Islamic invasions, for mere existence in a prolonged amount of time. But in absolute terms, of course, they are partaking the great re-expansion of Eurasian civilization. This is true also for, say, the Seljuks, the Arabs, again, Western Europeans and beyond, right? And this comes with, of course, the necessity, given the circumstances, to attempt a sort of military reform that could help, especially cope with the Westerners. There were the greater problems. The Turks were never really this great deal of a problem. We often treat Manzikert or Myriokephalon as if these were this, nails on the coffin of the Byzantine Empire, but it's absolutely false and wrong, also because these defeats actually came at the moment of peak of Byzantine expansion towards those directions, right? After Manzikert, Myriokephalon basically represents the peak. Like, had the Byzantines won at Myriokephalon, they would have reconquered the entire Anatolia, right? There was nothing irreversible about Manzikert. We will talk, again, a lot about this stuff because it's a very misunderstood history. But the greatest problem, by far, was the West, right? And when Emperor Manuel took on the role of Byzantine ruler, he grew increasingly worried about how the Romans, that is the Byzantines, could improve their military for the future. And again, unfortunately, we have just sort of pretty theoretical references, mostly to military equipment, tactics, but as we'll see now in a very ideal and sometimes also cryptic way. We'll try to interpret these to realize what was going on. For example, the Byzantines were traditionally, by this point, armed with round shields. You would say, what kind of information is this? It's an interesting information in the sense that actually the Byzantines did not really have just round shields. Actually, for example, the drop-shaped shield appeared in Constantinople at the same time of Ottonian Germany, was a pun, like you see it also in the Islamic world. We made a video about Seljuk infantry even, that you don't hear too much, but everybody was using that type of shield shape. But at large, it is true that the Byzantines would retain, first of all, this kind of round shield designs, mostly for which reason? The one that we illustrated at the beginning. This is also true if you look at what done recently, for example, Welsh warfare, the Celtic fringe, right? Round shields are smaller in general, and they are associated in this context to some lighter type of troops that, in fact, it turns out in the Byzantine history, make a lot of archery use, right? Essentially, there is this extremistic criticism in stereotyping pre-Comnenian Byzantine forces, or at least like pre-Emmanuel's forces to some degree, as mostly, look at how actually depleted our once sort of stronger Byzantine arms were, to the point of seeing so many archers among their ranks. So essentially lights as opposed to heavies, right? This is interpreted in this way. It actually makes a lot of sense because, as we said, there were lots of archers, not necessarily just Turkic auxiliaries. Those were really numerous, and especially even more at this point, where practically the Comnenians had for financial reasons to bail out from the idea of having a massive sort of provincially wide bulk of heavy troops, and so they preferred just to gather this larger auxiliaries una tantum when it was really needed, because those again were easy to get, and so they were good enough to spend without having to maintain more robust forces, right? Considering their overall cost also in peacetime. This is naturally an approximation because there was some provincial army at large. There were militias, there were, of course, decentralized commands. However, these had objectively declined in power compared to the higher Middle Ages. So from these various sources of the Comnenian era, we do get the idea that there were lots of archers with quivers and not much heavier troops, right? And this would essentially indicate the lightness and therefore the unsatisfactorily punching concreteness of the Byzantine army, especially against the Westerners. Again, if you look at the Battle of Dyrrhachium, you will realize what we're discussing here. The match between Western and Byzantine cavalry was really terrible for the latter. The chronicler Cinemus, we'll talk about a bit of sources of the time, remarked upon this in the very 12th century, the same Manuel's period. The bow had indeed always been and would remain after Manuel's reforms, if we can so call them, a key component of Byzantine military strategy, utilized by both local troops and crucially by their, again, Asiatic mercenaries. And the reason why we can't talk of reforms to occur is that at large armies change by themselves. There is really not much of a need to simply reform the entire system. Like we have often the idea that, or at least historically, we're often told that there were these autocrats, these military geniuses who changed the armies from a day to another, and they had they were the only ones who had understood how things would have really gone. They sort of had seen it all before. The others had not understood that because they were not like as good as them. This has never happened historically. There's never been actually a military reform that had anything to do with that, right? Military reforms were mostly administrative adaptations to realities that were de facto already in place. And what happened under Manuel was rather a political change, that is to say, a gradual opening to a greater feudalization and westernization of the Byzantine world at large, not just the military, but crucially passing through the co-opting and the bribing effect of Latin mercenaries. Right, Manuel passed also. These are the years of great rulers like Frederick Barbarossa or Richard Lionheart, Philip II Augustus, the great era of crusades, of tournaments. I recently made a video about 12th century knights and tournaments, and still, like in later centuries, at the time of Montaner, for example, it was remembered in the West that how great of a ruler Manuel Comnenus had been, but a great lord, as if he had been probably a Latin feudal monarch, right, that had hired so many Latins, had covered them in gold and settled them here and there across the empire. This is a very important phenomenon. It actually shows how permeable the Byzantine Empire was to the Westerners already at that point, but how, and this is at least a very debated topic in Byzantinistics still today, like if, Manuel's reign, or this policy had been fully embraced by his successors, it had sort of stretched over time, the Byzantine Empire could have even sort of saved himself, let's put it in these terms. It would have not fallen to the Crusaders. It would have had enough sort of feudal backbone to resist itself against those external forces. Naturally, this is a bit of a stretch, meaning that the fundamentals of the Byzantine world couldn't simply change that fast. In fact, they wouldn't. But it is possible that greater and further even privatization of the system, because the Comnenians had not really altered that, especially that imperial, courtly, like central capital control, like of the empire, like having opened to a greater in real formal feudalization, something more advanced than the pronoia system, could have given at least more immediate resources to spend. In some ways, even parceling the empire, etc. Think about the archery at this point. Many of them were Westerners. There was plenty of Frenchmen, of Germans, of Italians all over the Byzantine Empire at this point already, fighting for the emperor, and also with an important level of loyalty. We've seen the fee rank troops, for example, even at the service of the Sultanate of Iconium. It was actually a very westernized Islamic power, and not just because of Byzantine, also, again, of Latin influence. So you have, as I was saying at the beginning, you wonder, Schwerpunkt, why do you make all this, lengthy introductions? Because if you do not get that context and background, you can't understand how deeply, Western civilization had really infiltrated and began to manipulate all this outer space in virtue of its objective superiority, right? And in this way, right, Manuel was very open to the Latins, was considered an Esterophile to some degree, right? And this did really procure some bellyache, let's say, to many Byzantines, especially considering the constant tensions with the Crusaders, with the Italians, etc. Right? So, but that, as you know, is in fact what will escalate further things towards the worst end of the situation. The point, though, is that the Byzantines realized here, from a strictly strategical point of view, in terms of military culture, that even though the bow was a vital weapon tracing back many centuries, even to the time of the Roman Empire, where really the composite, for example, had entered from especially the eastern side of the empire, probably as a constitutive element of the Roman forces. This gradual step influence was overall incapable of, it was not a positive thing, right? It only reflected the gradual erosion of Roman statehood. And on the longer run, here after essentially a millennium, things had gone too far. And the system needed to change quickly. Right? Of course, a state could not simply be recreated. That was the entire issue. That also, it's not like the Comnenians were just pro-oligarchic or, say, the pro-private artistic forces at large. Just the Macedonian system had collapsed, and they didn't really have any other means but using this sort of more short, medium-term resources to literally just stay afloat and survive. Right, and this as a consequence of that total collapse. There weren't truly like centralized states anymore out there. Again, the Westerners will paradoxically go toward that direction in a couple of centuries because their feudal glue was so strong, and so paradoxically they had surpassed everybody in privatization and oligarchy, except for like the more vital communal city-states like the Italian peninsula, etc. That was a nice combination. In fact, it also shows you how multifaceted but still fundamentally robust and homogeneous Western civilization was, to the point of, in fact, of managing to consolidate a more grounded, stable, and functional power. The Byzantines weren't there yet. We're in between, right? And especially not in an overall, again, absolute and relative situation. In other words, the Byzantines needed tougher troops, heavier troops, something that could especially withstand Western cavalry charges in open field. Ongoing clashes with armies predominantly made up of light cavalry archers over subsequent centuries consistently reaffirmed, of course, the both significance in warfare against those peoples, but against the Latins it was another story. The horse archers would anyway play an indispensable role in Byzantine tactics, as they couldn't simply refound like a stronger bulk of force. They couldn't abandon this lighter bias that was also there in other peoples, like generally speaking in Eastern Europe, in the Balkans. Even if you look at, I don't know, countries like Hungary, Poland, or Bohemia, just saw them recently. These were, by the 13th century, you can argue fully westernized, but still, like, it was always like in their archaeological and iconographical evidence some details that, of course, reference to the fact that these were countries at relatively the fringe of now essentially Western Frankish Europe and the steppes, right? In relation with the steppes, that in fact routinely infiltrated with horse archers, and therefore also destabilizing these areas. Historically, think about the Mongol invasions, the raids into Central Europe during the 13th century, and all the pregressed civilizational issues and the sort of deeper bowels of Europe exposed to the steppes raids over the millennia. The Byzantines had from their side a hell, if anything, of resources, because still, like, they were a big power. They had, as we said before, at this point, like a very vast extent of land, fertile areas, like historically still developed ones, regardless of the comparison with West. We have under Manuel even the almost successful attempt of wiping out, for example, Norman Sicily. But on the longer run, you understand the fundamentals of this power are relatively unstable, right? When the Crusades happened, we have from the Western sources that are often, for anything existing in the East, the best evidence that we can have, even better than the sources produced by those Eastern peoples. In this case, like the evidence of the Byzantine army, showing substantial numbers of horse archers, in fact, for every Byzantine army, primarily provided by these Turkic auxiliaries such as Uzes, Seljuks, Pechenegs, Bulgars, Hungarians, Cumans, Mongols, Alans, Georgians. These were not all Turkic, of course, but they had like significant imprinting from those military cultures as well. We saw them. We saw them at the Battle of Dyrrhachium. We saw them at the Battle of Pelagonia. we'll make other videos, at the Battle of Antioch on the Meander, for example, that are all essentially fitting today's video chronology for Byzantine warfare. That's the importance of covering everything in detail, right? Even apparently niche topics that are, however, always useful in founding, in documenting, in really screen shooting, like all this military outlook, which, like, if you wonder why we always use sources, citations, especially in those tactical reconstructions, to prove that, of course, my broader takes on history are not the fruit of some sort of strange inclination. We are cementing, video after video, this whole picture, right? I personally not aware of any other channel that does what we do here, and believe me, like, after having made thousands of videos on the topic, I have some, sensitivity, let's put it in this way, to this kind of power balance. It's also because I really focus also in my extra YouTube life, professional life, on this kind of strategic assessment. So, on the battlefield, the horse archers, as we explained, predominantly served as skirmishers, often employing traditional Turkic tactics of harassment, feigned retreats, and ambush. Since late antiquity, the Byzantines had distinguished themselves in the successful capacity to emulate these tactics from foreign peoples by their regular military. However, in these later times, the practice had become just to really use these very foreigners as a substitute for those, again, peasant soldiers that were not quite able to perform this service anymore, right? With great cost, like expense, whatever. Now these peasants were mostly under the great landholders, again, of the Constantinopolitan Achaia, and mostly just, produced with labor force what was eventually spent to hire these other troops. In their stead, the Byzantines quickly recognized the importance of cavalry in Frankish tactics that really paralyzed the horse archery once. Right, we've seen it also during the Crusades, that this sort of weird post-Vietnam traumatic myth of, oh my god, the Westerners cannot cope with lighter forces, with guerrilla, with hit-and-run tactics, it is, from a strictly military historical point of view, completely false, besides being also deeply, and I stress deeply, incorrect from a fundamentally strategical point of view, right? If you have, like we explained this many times in so many videos, if you have the upper hand as any force, you just smash, you just punch in the face, right? And you can't fail, right? If things are balanced to a degree that do not allow you to fully use these tactics, right? And somebody can indeed lure you into ambushes, withdrawing, but the truth is that these guys are just buying time, hoping in turn that this is going to place them in sort of better condition, admitting in that very moment that in that moment they cannot punch you back because they do not have the force to do so, right? There was essentially for the Byzantines no other way, aside from those few heavy forces that of course they had. For example, the so-called Nicaphorian cataphracts were still around, right? But were extremely costly and at large, like the empire. They disappeared, in fact, during the Comnenian era, so it's not like they did not exist yet, but in order to field them, you had really to spend an eye of your head. And in general, again, in the numbers, we've seen it in the battles as well, the best tactic was to try, especially to use your own cavalry with hit-and-run tactics, if anything, to damage, to wound, to injure the Frankish horses. Right? This is not just a great solution in general, because it's the best thing you can do, but it's not going to make up for the lack of heavy forces. Right? The Franks kept on fighting against the Byzantines, against the Turks, general horse archery in the same identical way, right? And aside from the Mongol case, that was indeed the consequence of an enormous military experience and practice in the steppes at a transcontinental scale, etc., like successful, right? Essentially, even in the West, missile warfare, as you know, was quite advanced. The Byzantines found out, were really impressed by the Western crossbows, for example. But by definition, again, the light element cannot cope with a heavy one. And even though the Frankish horse barding was almost non-existent, this was obviously scarce, because the way you cover the field with the cavalry charge in terms of time and space really does not allow for any light element to simply devastate your mounts in any consistent fashion, unless your own cavalry, your own forces at large, are not tending to the light themselves. This was actually a problem of the same Byzantines, as we will learn now, as they had lighter heavy cavalry when confronting, for example, those Turkic steppe nomads, taking lots of losses. Not much in the horses per se, but in fact that their heavies, also properly as horsemen, were not as protected as that the fully mail armored Western knights, right? So in other words, the latter could simply charge into anything without being unhorsed or bogged down by missile elements. This naturally depends also on the strategic quantities on the field. This is not always true. It's not always the same outcome. It depends. Of course, if you're fighting in great moral, material, numerical privation, you will be defeated. Lots of Westerns were slaughtered all throughout this campaigns, as we know very well. But at large, they had the upper hand, and they won more often than not, causing massive bloodshed from the other side as well. This was the deal of war in all times, and it always will. The famous Alexiad by the Byzantine princess Anna Comnena, in fact, dealing with the deeds of her father Alexios I, recounts that in 1083, the Byzantine emperor commanded his soldiers, likely cavalry but possibly foot soldiers altogether, to drive hard on the heels of the Franks but avoid close combat. This is very interesting because, again, the Byzantines had indeed the capacity to run back and forth according to the Frankish charges and relative tournement, if we were to use the same knightly tournament terminology. That means exactly that, which is something they would do themselves, in fact, in the process, because they were lighter, right? And so, again, they would avoid coming at grips with this heavier knights, but they could harass them when they were withdrawing, right? The source said that they were to rain arrows from a distance, aiming at the horses instead of the riders, which was also considered very unchivalric from a Western point of view. Like in the West, we know that, I don't know, killing or injuring an enemy knight's warhorse was a very, bad thing to do from a moral and political point of view, because the idea was that if you're, again, that strong, you just smash into your enemy and you will prevail, right? Naturally, all kinds of tricks, tactics, ruses were used also in the West, But consider also there were lots of crossbowmen. If anything, we've seen in battles like the Iraqi that are very exemplificative of this, that in general the Westerners would advance, like trying to maintain cohesion, because this was crucial for the effectiveness of every military endeavor, but in particular those heavy cavalry charges, being actually quite nervous of all this hail of arrows that were incredibly frustrating from a psychological point of view, also because these forces were all loaded for, again, smashing to the face of the enemy. If the enemy withdrew, like you had all this adrenaline spent, this wore you down in many ways, and that's at some point, I don't know, look at the Battle of the Relay. I mean, in many ways, like the Westerners survived because they took so many arrows, but the Turks could simply not break through. That in many ways the odds were balanced like that, but still with effectively a Christian victory, right? So with the Byzantines it was similar. It had slightly heavier troops than these eastern foes, but they also lacked that effectively punching element on the same scale, at least of the Westerners. For the rest, the Byzantines had a hell of an equestrian culture. They had very good military technology. If anything, they didn't have the sort of general resources, both from a technical and sort of a human point of view, to simply match this much more uniformly drilled and sort of functionally fielded force that Latin Germanic culture could provide in general. In fact, telling the truth, the same crossbows, for example, that are becoming so prevalent in the West, are actually superior to enemy archery in general. This is even, it's also later on, the Mongols, the terrible Mongols with their steppe archery, etc., began to hire Frankish knights and Italian marines equipped with crossbows in the Indian Ocean, right, to fight piracy there. And we're talking about the Ilkhanate of Persia. But just for saying, like, how, like, we always underestimate Western quality. And remember that, again, political strategic outcomes can just be due to lack of motivation. Like, for example, like the broader end of the Ottoman states, as we know, that, however, was a very sort of closely fought business, with the Westerners actually losing so many chances just because there were plenty of resources, but they were not so interested to be there to begin with, besides like a few that really understood what's the deal. This is actually a problem still today. In any case, the sense of wearing out the enemy is still being able at some point to come to grips with him, right? If the Byzantines had just, I don't know, missile elements, just something to harass the enemy, not coming to grips with the enemy melee, they would have not even gone at war, right? They would just shut down into their cities, into their fortresses, and they would have not engaged. And this is naturally not what happens. These peoples are not so different after all. As we were saying before, they had also a hell of an equestrian culture, just of a different kind, and generally a more unfavorable one compared to the Franks. And so when they closed in on the Franks, they would unleash a barrage of arrows on the horses, hopefully completely disrupting the riders. There were similar tactics used also in the West, right? When hiring the Kumans, for example, the Hungarians did it often against German Bohemian enemies. Also in this case, what are we looking at? At the Battle of Markfeld, for example, the Kuman horsemen of the Hungarians apparently shattered the Bohemian and Moravian cavalry of Ottokar II that had just sent these guys in the front to absorb all those arrows, also for political reasons, because he detested his local ethnic nobility and preferred the German mercenaries and a more, in fact, progressive form of westernization for his country. And those guys are effectively disrupted by this hail of arrows, right? You find lots of incidents of this kind. You find in the Crusades really lots of Western knights dismounting, and not even at that point actually being effectively worn out by, say, Turkic archery, but still significantly depleted in horses, right? So consider the horse is also a very delicate animal. It can do enormous things, like, I don't know, in a day covering 150 kilometers, but if you cripple it, it's done for, right? You can't sort of use it anymore, especially for war. So there were ways to deal with this. For example, the Westerners developed the Turcopoles that we also covered. They're essentially like the Western response to Eastern horse archery. We've seen in the 13th century the Battle of Pelagonia, where the Byzantine Turkic auxiliaries were instructed to focus on the horses of the Frankish troops. Consider that at that point, Western cavalry was at its peak, politically, militarily, socially. Still, this was the preferred approach. Contemporary accounts observe that, in fact, this horse archers did manage to slaughter the Frankish steeds and winning the battle. As we've seen in the video, the situation was a bit different. In that case, it seems that part of the army sort of defected, others were still, crushed by other Westerners that were in the Byzantine army. But it's interesting to notice that at least the same Byzantine chronicles at that point stereotyped themselves as the guys who, in fact, were better at this kind of harassment rather than smashing into the enemy like that. And we do not have, in fact, any evidence that that tactic alone was successful. Remember, it's always about combined arms. Admittedly, the Westerners, especially in the mid-13th century, were so confident with their heavy cavalry charges that they would be able to put themselves into trouble like that, like, I don't know, charging on difficult terrain or whatever, but that was not the norm. They were also kind of aware of that. As if, their infantry and missile elements, however, had not been so crucial. And this has also to do with the very heavily feudal literature of the time that tends to obscure a bit the role of the footmen, that were instead very important and did really complement the heavy cavalry action, that even though decisive and dominant, especially in that moment in the art of war, was, however, always to cooperate with this other element. Besides, the same Byzantines had problems against the Turks, that they did fight themselves, as you know. The Turks, in fact, also concentrated their fire on the horses of the Byzantines, that, however, were the better army there. So the same thing we just said about the Westerners is valid when you talk about the Byzantines against these lighter opponents, right? And again, that's how the Byzantines recovered the entirety of Anatolia, up to Myriokephalon. How did they do that? Because, of course, they were the stronger of in the clash, right? So they managed to recover lots of land, and in general, like, they would fight with substantially heavier troops that the Turks could not quite easily meet in open ground. But they were also much more deteriorated sort of public culture and state, and they almost, got wiped out again from Anatolia. In his commentary, Nicephorus Bryennius, that was Anna Comnenus' husband, in fact, seems to have been particularly informed by her husband about lots of military issues. We discussed this also from a philological point of view regarding her version of the Battle of the Iraqian. Again, you can check that video out if you're interested. So Bryennius was an important commander. He had a hell of a military experience. He also dealt with the Crusaders, defending Constantinople during the First Crusade. Narrates that at Manzikert, 1071, so this major Byzantine defeat that, however, wasn't that horrifying disaster in a strictly military sense. It was mostly from a political point of view, because the Emperor Romanus was captured by the Turks, and so this opened to lots of other issues. But it as a battle, and we'll see it again, it's, I think, the only video that I really lost on Schwerpunkt during the re-upload phase. It was an old one. We can do better, but it was well done still in showing that the Turks did not really annihilate the Byzantine army at Manzikert. they defeated it, it withdrew, etc. It was a great disaster, but say the army at large remained intact, did make it to the camp again. So this is very different from the habitual breaking of the enemy lines, the disaster, the complete rout. However, still, well, in that occasion, one of Alp Arslan's commanders, that was the Turkic Sultan at the head of the army, quote, ordered his troops to encircle the Byzantines and unleash a storm of arrows upon them from all sides. The Byzantines, seeing their horses struck by arrows, were compelled to pursue the Turks, but they suffered heavily as they fell into ambushes and traps. So also in this case, because that's why the battle is actually so didactic, this is what happens, not just at this small unit tactics that sort of more vividly and sort of intuitively exemplify what was going on, and people mostly think warfare is about. But this is something that, from a more strategic point of view, is evident throughout the entire day of battle. How was the Battle of Manzikert fought? Basically, the Byzantines advanced throughout the entire day in open field, and the Turks retreated all the freaking way, just shooting while retreating, going back and forth with the swarms of horse archers, but not closing on the Byzantines were their scarcely, let's say, heavy reserve of the Sultan that could not break the Byzantine army. It was too bulky, right? Just hoping, in fact, to tire it down through as exhausting and frustrated march under the dust, like in this constant state of agitation, not knowing whether from the umpteenth swarm of horse archers would suddenly emerge, like probably the Turkic heavies that, of course, the same Byzantine forces had to be wary of. And so the sense was also luring the heavies into circumstances in which they would be weaker. So individually, right? Exiting the formation, chasing the Turks down some rabbit hole and ended up, in fact, surrounded, butchered down, which was in many ways the only way the Turks could simply sort of attrition the enemy in an effective fashion. By the way, exhausting themselves. I mean, from the other side, the Turks were performing extraordinarily just to lure the enemy in that way, because it was the only way to win on the longer run, hoping this balance, these odds to be turning, gradually tilting ever more in favor of the Turks by the time that some heavier force had to break through. And again, they don't make it. They destroy some Byzantine forces, but the army does withdraw. Even still exhausted under enemy fire, whatever, but still not broken. Earlier, Attaliates, that is another 11th century, this was mostly like a jurist, a historian, so more strictly narrative source, records instances of Pecheneck horse archers who, quote, panicked the horses of their enemies with their wounds and forced the Byzantines to flee in disgrace. Again, other case in which this could happen, it would happen, but it's also not quite the norm. And just with this, you see how relatively simplistic the explanation really is. When we reconstruct the art of war, we do not, this is true for history at large, history is not the mechanical citation of a source, as many people believe that history is, but the critical analysis of that source, which is a completely different thing. And in this case, what you can't profitably criticize in order to analyze this military context is that, of course, at large, in this clash between the Byzantines and the Pecheneck, of course, the Pecheneck horse archers would have wounded and killed many Byzantine horses that, as it was the norm at the time, were not too heavily armored because it would have been too overwhelmingly expensive. Just a very narrow elite of any of these peoples. Also, the Pechenecks had heavily armored horses, other than knights themselves. But again, this mostly happened in a context in which the very strategic forces would not allow the Byzantines to simply press on the enemy, and sort of they stood there knowing that advancing was sort of not useful, that they would have had to sit there and take it, hoping the enemies to be too weak to eventually break them through. And instead, many horses were wounded, and this created problems to the Byzantines that likely would not be defeated just because of that. That could be the tip of the iceberg, right? But not in the tip of the balance as well. But not, in fact, the bulk of the balance. That is a completely different thing. In response to the effectiveness of these tactics, because also the Pechenegs were quite a pain in the behind, we've made multiple videos about how, in fact, Alexios I had to cope with them together with the Turks, with the Normans. The same Alexios devised a new formation, unfortunately pretty ambiguously described in the Alexiad as being arranged such that, quote, the ranks were organized so that the Turks would be forced to shoot from their right at the Roman left, which was shielded. Conversely, the Romans would shoot left-handed at the Turks' exposed right. Now, I've gotten through it. There are so many ways to find weird explanations of how this would have been the case, none of which, in fact, seems militarily logically coherent and practicable on a repeated scale, right? Left and right are not just, some fundamental spatial direction. You cannot simply alter them, and you cannot simply find another way to fight asymmetrically that nobody had ever devised before, and that just the Byzantines had, and that at the end of the day brought to them to still have enormous military issues, and not, of course, always or even say winning against the this peoples. Or getting rid of them to begin with. And so trying to find any kind of explanation to this seems practically impossible, right? It remains uncertain, for example, if this implies a line angled away from the Turkic formation. Plus, again, it's the same source, and this is what I said at the very beginning, like the Byzantine sources are that vague, weird, abstract, theoretical. They're this typically Serbelotic sort of Hellenic form of simple, say, almost wishful thinking detached from the actual practice that, of course, the same Byzantines would have had, right? So there's no doubt the Byzantines were very competent and capable of coping with Turkic tactics, but the fundamentals of space would not change at their wish, and so the general sense here was just to show, we're Byzantines, we're cleverer than them, we're intellectually superior, these are barbarians, just use this tactic and we will defeat these guys all the time. The truth is that the Byzantines did have overall, from a sort of theoretically tactical point of view, more often than not, the upper hand on the Turks, even without this sort of fantasies, that fabrications you can find in the manuals that are, again, sometimes interesting, sometimes important, sometimes, if you read the various advice that is given, whatever, just sometimes they are really impenetrable in just a set of notions, because this is most of what ancient and medieval treatises really are, just a collection of anecdotes of some sort of intellectual divertissement, literary exercise, to give some wisdom, some insight, but having nothing to do with actual contemporary military, say, strategic analysis, right? That's the reason why, I don't know, Sun Tzu, I'm sorry to say that, it's a masterpiece, but it's also a fraud in strictly, practically applicable senses. There are things like, you should never besiege a city. What? Consider that this was written at the time of Pythagoras. You may want to read von Clausewitz, that was written at the time of Kant and Hegel, and that tells you at large what war is, also for a much greater clarity about the world, from which you can go into a bit more like theoretically applicable depth of military strategy and tactics. Another formation apparently adopted, according to these sources, in the face of a Turkic army was the close order column, which is sort of more understandable. And this is described also by other sources in other circumstances, in fact. This is essentially the column of march that you would have to use to essentially advance into hostile territory against enemies that were always there to lure you into an ambush, and that you had sort of, accepting attacks from at some point. So the idea here was arrange the troops in a way that the reaction against especially Turkic attacks would be swifter. In fact, there is a very interesting Franco-Byzantine cooperation, like mutual support and discussion regarding, in fact, anti-Turkic tactics. As you know, the Crusades are generally hostile towards the Byzantines, but during the Crusades at large, the Franks must just cross the Byzantine Empire to reach the Holy Land. And even though they would have liked to conquer Constantinople, that this is what would have eventually happened, there was a general consensus that there was an overall Christian enterprise, and there was some sharing insight on the tactics to use against these peoples. And the Byzantines would also, in fact, instruct the Franks of how to cope with these Turks, crossing the Anatolian hinterland, having to fight with them later on. In fact, it's likely that Emperor Alexios, that was the guy who also had asked the West for help. He wished essentially Frankish mercenaries. The Byzantines had been using Vikings, Normans, Franks from quite a while in their armies. We will talk more about this in other videos because, again, Western mercenaries had always existed in different directions. But he was likely the first guy to educate at least a Crusader army about this tactic to employ against the Turks, in fact, in a strategic circumstance that made sense, right? No time before a Western army had crossed the Byzantine territory to reach Palestine, that was in Seljuk hands at that time, and needing to give them an insight on these sort of Eastern tactics. We will talk more about how the Westerners had, of course, already coped with Eastern horse archery, even in the European heartland. Think about the Magyars, right? We talked recently about the Avars. So the same Byzantines did use this tactics themselves at times against the Westerners. In any case, this is the context. 1096, at the very least, Anna Comnenus states that Alexios, her father, instructed the Franks, quote, on how to form a battle line, how to conduct ambushes as well. The latter aspect is fascinating. We'll explain now why. And, quote, not to pursue too far when the enemy retreated, right? Especially the aspect on ambushes is very cool because of the general notion that the Westerners would have gained this greater sort of liberty in tactics, let's put it in this way, compared to their thickly packed Conrad formation to perform perfectly aligned shock charges, etc. And so the idea that during the Crusades, the Westerners learned from these Eastern peoples how to, perform flank attacks or ambushes or feign flight. They already did it all by themselves. Indeed, however, this was, a time in which, again, the Crusaders were to cope on a large scale with peoples like the Seljuks that were really masters in this tactic. So it's obvious that especially Anna Comnena would write from the top of this Byzantine elite perspective, like on how this Western barbarians that were basically better than almost anyone, essentially, except the Byzantines, that was the point, into overwhelming cavalry charges, because the Byzantines, the Arabs, recognized how good the Westerners really were. But they lacked this other insight and strategy, and they needed a bit of guidance. This is also not really what the reality was. Nevertheless, we can imagine these talks to have really happened. Especially also the latter aspect seems, if anything, the more obviously prudent one. Like, don't pursue these guys too far. Paradoxically, this is instead than flank attacks or ambushes or feint flights, etc., the most precious advice, right? Because you can be the best soldier out there, but still falling to that mistake of pursuing the enemy, falling into his trap. This is, as we've seen, what he's really waiting for you to do. Naturally, the Westerners would know this already. However, like, double checking was never enough against those Turks. The Alexiad also gives a detailed depiction of such marching column as used in the Philomelian campaign in 1116. We will look at this at some point, illustrating the Byzantines, quote, marching in a disciplined fashion, keeping time to the sound of the flute. Indeed, the tightly interlocked shields and marching band created the impression of unmovable mountains, and when they shifted direction, the formation moved as if it were a single massive beast, animated and directed by one unified mind. The return journey was taken slowly, at an almost ant-like pace, carrying captives, women, children, and all the plunder securely placed in the center of the column. This is a very beautiful passage that illustrates the care that the Byzantine troops had for good order during these advances. Everything is readily explained. The Turks would always try to, again, infest these enemies on the march, wearing them out, as we've seen before, and knowing that, again, they were mostly lighter elements that were not even properly meant to come to grip with the enemy, if not when this was broken and we could pursue them, would have to harass them. But also create this psychological warfare, confusion in general, to allow the enemies to essentially to break at some point. Like, even small, narrow passages could be exploited by ever greater forces at a time that could even sort of break the entire system. It was actually a very delicate thing for the same attackers to do. We discussed often in Schwerpunkt how you can't, in a broader strategic sense, exploit, for example, the obvious gaps that exist between a unit and another at, the company level, for example. If we're talking different divisions that are, spaced, as it happened during these marches, hundreds of meters, it's another story. You can try to sort of cut them off from one another. This is what actually, if you want to, a very beautiful picture of this. Look at the Battle of Aten. Famously enough, I made a video when the Ayyubids, under the same famous Saladin, being such a great and skilled leader that could perform this kind of tactics, would succumb, in fact, to his forces. That battle, for example, also showed you it was not a completely tactical disaster. It was more a political issue, because of the three Crusader columns, the central one with the king, that theoretically should have been more protected, was the only one to be taken out. Right, the Christian vanguard and rear guard actually saved themselves because the Ayyubids did not really have the capacity to simply break them, or even just to chase them and destroy them in a full sense. So even the losses are probably much more contained in numerical terms than we think. That illustrates very well how, in a sense, how balanced the odds were, but in that sense, how much you had to sweat just to break these forces, especially if you were, again, the ambushing guy that did not have the simple force to meet them face to face. Like if Saladin had simply met those guys in open field face to face, he would have likely lost. In order to recur to an ambush, like of course you may have an enemy who falls into an ambush, like in this case, in a way that he should have not done. And so you place him in a condition of inferiority that is exactly what you want your enemy to be, and so it's perfectly fine and perfectly obvious. But the Battle of Athens was so sort of closely and hardly fought that you can understand how things would have been different had the Crusaders been properly arrayed for conventionally pitched battle, and the Ayyubids had done the same, right? So this is in general the picture. The Byzantines were also in this case the heavier element, and the Turks weren't. And so the sense is that they had to be extremely careful. Here you see all the general precautions, defending the baggage with the vulnerables, the captives, the loot, right? And all the treasures that normally armies moved with. Also to keep the soldiers together in many ways. The animals, think about horses, are so precious. In fact, there's this idea that the Crusaders will do the same. They would have the cavalry marching in the midst of the column, surrounded by infantry, because the Turkic arrows were quite dangerous for the horses. And in many cases, you would find these knights on foot because their mount had been significantly crippled to prevent it from being used, also to chase the enemy. That they didn't really need to do. Here, all they needed to do was to maintain position. Of course, here, general strategic premise, being ambushed is not really the best situation. If you are in column, you're not, as we just said, in an ideal formation to fight, which you should do as a line. Naturally, these columns were, as we've seen also many other times in history, there's a very interesting sort of set of options. They're still hotly debated for how, for example, the Romans had their legions disposed, arrayed during the march, also in function of the redeployment in a battle line, right? Which is essentially what the column must do, right? And you meet the enemy as a battle line. However, during the Crusades, these Turkic tactics were so insidious, also in this different, we're not talking also most of the times overwhelmingly large amount of forces. We've had Hatton as the best example of it because it was really the greater issue there. But climatic battle, designing a great deal of the Crusades, etc. But normally, again, the sense is that the Turks would try mostly to infiltrate from this condition of inferiority and create havoc, like making things appear worse than they actually were. And so here the Byzantine source insists on the order, like at the sound of the musical instruments that were crucial for that, given the tempo for the march, the step, so that all the forces would move without sort of losing cohesion. Interlocked shields, especially, that's an excellent anti-missile tactic. Shield walls have practically nothing to do with any special fighting capacity. They're just what you want to have to maintain cohesion among the troops if these are especially green or they don't have much training to stick together during the melee. So it's actually not for particularly professional troops that tend to be instead better armored and more individually dynamic, even when fighting in formation, but mostly protecting themselves from the arrows. Right? We've seen in different videos how the entirety of the peoples that cope with enemy, say, horse archers tend to use interlock shields, developing specific designs to properly cover as much as possible. For example, I don't think it's really well documented for the Byzantines, but we saw this among the Slavs in general, all from the Balkans to Eastern Europe. We've seen it where there was a lot of crossbow, volume of fire. The Italians developed these larger square shields that are also in fact known in the Levant as Janovia, after the Genoese, that the Arabs also use against the Turks, right? These ethnic differences are relevant because, again, we've seen, especially in the recent video about Egyptian warfare, how Arab warfare is more foot-based, is sort of more Western compared to the Turkic one. The objective not having any arrow pass, ideally, right? And then, of course, like with arrows, you can do lots of things, including some parabolic. It's always, every trajectory is parabolic, but you can have a more arcuated fire also with arrows coming from the above. We will talk about this in other videos, but mostly like this ant-like pace, especially in the return journey, where the army was sort of more loaded, as we've seen here with women, children, captives, and so on. So creating a bit more of problem, swelling the ranks, or at least the size of these formations, to contain them, to defend them, required maintaining cohesion at all costs, maintaining formation, maintaining order. Right? This is so crucial. It can never be stressed enough, right, in any military matter. Conversely, the Turks were all scattered as horse archers. Again, they had their reserves of heavy cavalry awaiting freshly somewhere, looking, especially overlooking from the distance. It's also true for Alp-Arslan at Manzikert, ready to intervene as a reserve, but only when the enemy is being worn out. These horse archers have to harass continuously. So the objective of the Byzantines in this case is maintaining their formation, which they will generally do. Again, yes, there are episodes like Manzikert, Myriokephalon. These are all ambushes in a sense, especially the latter in some gorges, etc. We will talk about that. But the outcome of that battle is also pretty, especially if you look at the rest of the campaign, you realize that, first of all, the war went on for other 2 years. Iconium had to be evacuated, so it's not like the Byzantines simply lost at Myriokephalon. That's a bit of a myth, whatever, but that indicates, of course, a very good circumstance in which the Byzantines would have been ambushed by the Turks. Because at some point, you had to cross some places, right? It was not even about being unknowingly ambushed or simply being surprised, right? You knew you had to cross a pass because there was no other way out. If you had to come back home, you know that the pass was guarded by the enemy. Nevertheless, you had to go through, to pass through. Sometimes you must do that. And so at that point, it was a pretty complicated situation, but you could hope to extricate yourself from it. This is a very interesting, again, order of battle, and as we were saying before, Alexios Comnenus would have instructed the Westerners to mostly cope with this, this constant infiltration that the Turks would have attempted, given also the general autonomy that every sort of horse archer warband would have had, to infiltrate the gaps, to create problems, and again, not doing much individually, but all together, disordering the system, and so wearing it out and creating those conditions that could have favored eventually a full attack with the heavies. Interestingly, the Turks reacted to this formation in a manner similar to their response to a Frankish column, directing their attacks at the rearguard and vanguard while skirmishing along the flanks, which is sort of the most obvious one in a sense. It depends what you have to do from a strategical point of view. What you would hopefully want, like by blocking here, by attacking both the rearguard and the vanguard, is to properly block the entire army, to pin it down. The center would be the more robust part of the army. also probably the softer one to a degree. Maybe with a stronger core, but still more elements. The sense also is that your objective as a column was to go on. So the vanguard, as it would happen at Hattin, for example, would actually successfully break through the enemies and save himself, extricate themselves from it. And so opening a path that could be dangerous, of course, for anybody involved. And so, like, you have lots of horse archers also tend to come back. Like, they will exhaust arrows at some point, but they do not need to be ordered in a formation of some sort. They are scattered. They are in open order, in loose order. They can basically be reemployed as long as they are, still in some strength. Still, they lack that punching capacity. They can surround, they can harass, etc. If you want instead to properly disarticulate this column, you can, of course, attack here and there. You can, attack the rear guard. And rear guard attacks are a problem. This is true also. These tactics are not just Turks versus Byzantines or Crusaders. They're used everywhere, right? By infantry-based armies as well. There is nothing specifically tactical or strategical about the notion. You want to destroy the rear guard, you want to... But what do you want to do? Right, there are different things you may be seeking here. And it depends sometimes just on the circumstance. Of course, a rear attack is a problem because it does not allow you, again, to think about Charlemagne at Roncesvalles. In that case, the rear guard was left behind voluntarily, also by the same Roland, according to the story, right? So we will see that battle because it's also so epic in many ways, as you know, for later literature, etc. But it well illustrates also these strategic circumstances in which you could find yourself. The objective in that case was, say, sacrificing yourself for allowing the rest of the army to go on, assuming that in fact the enemy was just pursuing and trying to attack to sort of eat this part of the army and letting the rest go, right? So that's why you also deploy some of the finest troops in the vanguard in the rear guard. Some elite forces, like Roland's, for example, in that case, a veritable paladin. It's not, well, in that case, mostly also a commander, but there were elite forces. You scatter with them. Nevertheless, in all this, like the standard Byzantine battle formation consisted typically, like also for other peoples, of several successive lines. We've seen it at the Battle of Pelagonia, for example. There we are in the 13th century, which is a bit the peak of that sort of depth formation, because it's a century dominated by cavalry tactics, so differently from other times where cavalry tactics were dominant, but infantry was also relevant. You wouldn't have this need of just having different reserves of cavalry sent into the fray, and mostly this long corridor, like a sort of tournament, right, to gradually dose those forces. That at other times there were instead longitudinal formations, mostly with a center and wings. Here instead it's multiple battle lines in depth, spaced also by some 100 meters. This was really typical, 500, because you didn't it was really dangerous to have the battle lines in depth, so otherwise so closely so closely deployed, because you could, if one collapsed, it could cause a domino effect on the other. Instead, 500 meters was enough, so that even if one got broken, as it also had to be the case, because many of them also further distanced themselves as they had to go ahead to meet the enemy in the center of the battlefield, the fugitives would have taken all different directions. They would not overwhelm the posterior lines. That at that point should have exploited the situation and fall on the enemy, on the spent enemies at that point. And it's this game of who basically arrives to the last, and all weird things happen. This is also the peak in military history where flank attacks, right, and this in-depth formations really has obviously the greater effect, because you can, it's like a long corridor. If you attack the enemy from the rear, you can sort of take out, from the flank, you can take out one of these battle lines, especially those engaged in already in combat with your own. We've seen it at the Battle of Tagliacozzo. That is also one of the greatest examples of that. In fact, during the same centuries. We've seen at the Battle of Pelagonia how many Frenchmen, how many Germans there were in those ranks. Sometimes the battle lines were four, if you wanted to exasperate that concept of in-depth formation, of gradual really spending of resources, of reserves during combat. This happened also in Western tactics that were much more sort of punching, as we've seen. There were some spearheads, and especially in the first battle lines. But mostly also in that case, up to 13th century, mostly it was about 2 or 3 lines. The Byzantines tended, however, to have a different balance from the Westerners. In fact, the first line generally consisted of weaker, less reliable troops in the Byzantine case. This is because, as we've seen at large, they didn't have so many heavies, and the general purpose here was presumably to disrupt the enemy while absorbing the shock of the initial charge. Like, the sense is that even if you are, for example, from the other side, let's assume that you have heavy troops, right? If you charge into these lights that can also run away, you sort of spend those heavy troops as well. So, in many ways, like, if, say, let's assume the entire army was made of lights and the enemy won entirely of heavies, which would have been never the case, but tendentially, as we've seen between these two cultures, would have been mostly the direction, the heavies would have steamrolled the lights. Actually, they would have simply pierced through them, or this would have dispersed without even fighting, right? But still, like, if things are a bit more balanced, you can put an enemy unit out of combat by simply tire them down, to wind it, to making them charge into nothing. As we've seen, for example, the Battle of Markfeld with the Bohemian and Moravian heavies at large that, however, have to sit there because they can't simply charge into the Cuman horsemen, because those are going back and forth. You can't. All right, it doesn't make any sense to chase them. You will be cut down more quickly. But at the end of the day, they are inservable because they are spent. The horses are wounded, and so you can't have this similar. Of course, you must have enough horse archers. This is what is often missed. That horse archers were many, right? So much of the balance is also not the type of cavalry, but the numerical proportion. And technically, you are surprised by how many the horse archers were compared to the enemy heavies, and so how actually much superior in interest of quality these were at large. So something that you would have many horse archers to have any kind of result, but you also needed really lots of them just to be sure that you could absorb the energies even of a small amount of enemy heavies. That's why, again, at large, lights lose against the heavies. This, in fact, facing the Franks was so relevant. You needed really to throw so many horse archers at them to even have any effect on their charges, right? The Franks were deemed to be potentially irresistible in their initial charge. That's what they were famous for. This is already evidence in the Strategicon in the 6th century, that the so-called blonde-haired peoples had this fanatic bravery for which they charged, right, just into. And normally those charges at the time were good, but were not particularly orderly. And so instead, in the times of the Crusades, Latin Germanic charges were really something. They were just overwhelmingly feudal and professional troops that literally did only that in their entire lifetime. So here we're going just by general outlook. Say the second line was of course responsible for supporting the first line if necessary and preventing enemy attempts to outflank. This is especially the case. It's not that especially the heavies would have tried to outflank you. Normally, this more far ahead units were smaller, so if anything, in that case, it could have been possible that, depending on the size of the enemy battle line, that you could be outflanked even with lighter troops. The greater idea was, again, hopefully to absorb the enemy impact, to disorder their charge so that you could use these lines behind to sort of overwhelm them. Of course, there was a general purpose of spiriting the first line, having someone close at hand to make them feel that they could be backed up. However, in general, battle lines were independent, were not really meant to support one another. Right? One thing is a smaller unit tactics, like you have multiple ranks, say, and just the first ones are actually in the fray, the others are backing up in the literal sense that if somebody falls, another enters the fray. Cavalry charges were carried out also from the heavies like that. Like normally just the first two ranks did actually charge. Like the others would stop just, even though they did really charge in the last 100 meters, they would stop, or at least they would slow down to see what the first two ranks did, because it's not like with the infantry you can press each other. Like in American footballs, the horse just bash into one another. So the posterior ranks have to slow down and potentially just filling the gap that was potentially too open if the first ranks did successfully smash into the enemy line. We'll talk about how cavalry charges were actually carried out at some point. But the battle lines are truly something else. These are battalions, right, at large, and they must operate, as we've seen, also at a certain distance from one another. There is all kind of stuff, like there are some blinds that sacrifice themselves to lure the enemy into traps. They fake to be certain units, right? There are lights that act as heavies in disguise. There's a very interesting set of ruses. Unfortunately, we don't have too much of this for the Byzantines, because also the idea is that there were looser formations, or at least they were not to hold ground for particularly long, especially against the Franks, right? In any case, they also could, in certain circumstances. Skirmishers, so the horse archers in the Byzantine army typically advanced ahead of the main army and or were positioned on the flanks, which we've seen, for example, in the Battle of Pelagonia. The Westerners would have footmen, instead the Byzantines, like the Turks and other Easterners, would have horse archers, which also made them much more markedly mounted armies than the Westerners. The reason of this is that again, Western superiority again, because the Western footmen are actually superior to enemy horse archers, because the latter are light, while the Western foot are heavy, right? So they can actually fence off those horse archers. It's what we were saying before, that sort of the step dimension loses to the sedentaries, that also have their counter missile capacity, by the way. Some detachments of horse archers occasionally were concealed far out on one or the other flank. This is to be observed at Calaura in 1078. As we said before, flank attacks were an important thing. Flank attacks are psychologically devastating. So it doesn't even matter whether they are carried out by particularly heavy forces. We have seen in different videos about Byzantine cavalry formations how, for example, from the Strategicon, not from this era, but it's not like things had overwhelmingly changed in the strategic essentials. You could attack even in open order. Like if there was no time to reorder the battle line, but you could fall on the enemy rear, especially when he was pinned down by other forces, was fighting, was busy fighting. You could simply run into their ranks without even an order, and that would be enough to break them, right? Because that's what's really all about. Usually in this case, the enemy cannot resist, right? You can't fight on two fronts with the same unit for obvious reasons. The entire thing of flank attacks, I participated to a conference once talking about flank attacks, and in my experience, flank attacks are always remembered when they succeed, not when they didn't happen. So and they happen almost all the time, so my general intuition is that they were used by everybody, but just those who actually won were remembered. Otherwise, it would have been really normal to do such things. And again, also the notion that the Westerners would have needed to learn the stuff from the Turks, from the Byzantines, is nonsense. They had always existed everywhere, also in the West. Just now at this point, there is better documentation, there are bigger battles, so we have better accounts, we can reconstruct more clearly how things happen. Without mentioning that some Western sources that cared about chivalric ideals tended to hide this thing of the flank attack because it was deemed to be immoral in some ways, but I will make videos explaining this, because not all the sources that talk about this are actually most of them, as you know, they aren't military. And so paradoxically, when the very few privileged times in which it's a military man who writes this, that you realize that the chivalric idea wasn't quite there. I mean, they believed in it, but you realize that the practice of warfare was distinctively different and much sort of dirtier, if we can so say. Naturally, Byzantine horse archers could be found in the second, third, or even fourth lines. This was, as we've seen, really the typical pattern of the battle line. A heavy center and light wings, mostly of horse archers. For instance, we've seen it at the Battle of Dyrrhachium in 1081. The Vardarios, that was a regiment of Turks, occupied the second line behind the Varangians. You can actually consider, in the light of the Siculo-Norman charges against these posterior lines, because the Varangians get crushed, right? And so, considering that the Normans mostly had all heavies in their front ranks, even if they were likely less, we tried to make a bit of maths there. While charging into these Byzantine lines, would find lots of lights, and so they could simply also outflank the enemy in turn if they would give way, right? And so weakening the general consistency of the line. At the Battle of Dyrrhachium, we also saw how the Varangian commander was instructed to quickly open his ranks by moving left and right whenever the Vardarios wished to charge the Franks, and to close ranks afterwards and march in close order once they had withdrawn. This happened also because these skirmishers worked in open order, so it was really normal, aside from any kind of Varangian evolution here, that they mostly had to keep their ranks quite compact and close into their spaces. Like this, skirmishers could cross, right? So not among the rank and file soldiers, but in the gaps between the subunits. Skirmishers in advance of the primary army typically retreated in this manner when threatened, generally seeking refuge behind flanks armed cavalry instead of infantry. It was really normal. It happened also for the Frankish forces, right? The lights can't always do that. They will mostly, Sometimes you open the confrontations, skirmishing, if especially there is just like enemy infantry in the front, so they don't risk to be overrun. If the enemy cavalry especially shows up, or they are exhausted, or they have just to leave space for the bigger engagements, they will simply pass through the heavier units because they can, because they're not information themselves, and also keep fighting as support forces. Again, lights, they will not make most of it, but in the engagement they would be still useful. Alternatively, the lights sometimes dispersed left and right in response to an enemy charge, encircling the flanks in the process. This was also the norm. Like if you managed to pin the enemy down, and if, for example, a flank attack destroyed the enemy wings, the center could be outflanked by your own wings, aside from being potentially further overrun by the flank attack. The Lancers, and so the point was to overwhelm, especially the heavies that would normally keep on fighting, even when attacked from the flank, just with numbers, with mass, right? Sometimes with the same missile troops at close range was devastating against horse bellies that, as we've seen, were normally unprotected. As for any other light troop that could, I don't know, disembowel these guys with knives, like even with very light equipment and so on. The heavies would advance in close formation, appearing to charge with their lances couched, if cavalry. However, it seems that it was only under Emperor Manuel Comnenus that Byzantine cavalry first, quote, excelled the prowess of Frenchmen and Italians in this type of combat. This is particularly relevant because it essentially means that only by the time of Manuel Comnenus the Byzantine cavalry was apparently as tough as the one of France and Italy, which, however, does not add up, considering that the general consistency of the Byzantine forces remained lighter than the Western one, right? So here it was mostly just some I mean, you can find in the sources this kind of statements, but without really counting all the rest of military history of the same years that tells you something different. Of course, the French and the Italians had exactly that heavier type of cavalry that would overwhelm the Byzantines, not just in open field. I mean, French and Venetian knights were the ones who stormed the walls of Constantinople, right? But in the 13th century, there was still this very open notion that it's confirmed by all the iconographic evidence about arms and armor, by all the engagements. We saw Byzantine warfare during this period at large in other videos, that so that was a Frankish saying that a single Frankish knight was worthy 20 Byzantines, which perhaps is an exaggeration, but it's not that far from the truth. Like if we talk about horsemen, especially in general. In other aspects, the formations and tactics demonstrated at this point little variation from the time of the early and the higher Middle Ages. The only point in Byzantine warfare that is worth noticing is that the role of infantry became arguably even more peripheral than before. The Byzantines actually had good infantry. It's like, it's, again, the bare minimum was always met, right? The Byzantines were a civilization. They had their own power, so it's not like they lacked troops. But let's say, I don't know, did the Byzantines have the same tough, courageous, compact, aggressive, combative, specialized forces that, I don't know, the Italian communal armies could have on foot? No, right? And the same goes for cavalry. There isn't such a thing, right? Western infantry is heavier, Western cavalry is heavier, and in general, again, if you are to face the Byzantines, like, you're going to be worried it's not just by having heavier cavalry or infantry that you will simply win. If anything, it's also a matter of numbers, as we've seen at the Iraqian, but not necessarily a decisive one. In fact, at the Iraqian, the Siculo-Normans won, also because of this overwhelming charges that were really something. So at large, again, the notion that there was a substantial difference between the Westerners and the Byzantines is definitely accurate, is definitely of merit, of quality, right? At large, the forces could be balanced, right? But this is a political and more broadly strategical consequence. Let's say you needed enough troops to meet the enemy in open field, so you would take what was needed. But it's not like on average at large these forces were just the same. These military cultures were the same. They were the product of different political and social systems. The Byzantines did not have the level of overall, say, political territorial cohesion that the Westerners had. They didn't have the level of socio-economical prosperity that the Westerners had. They didn't have, at this point, a strong navy. They had to rely on the Western ones. They didn't have a strong cavalry. They had to rely on the Western one. So you understand that everything adds up, and the system is gradually taken over by the Westerners well before 1204. And again, it could have been different, because if Constantinople had not fallen, we would have talked about something else historically. But still, the fact that that city would not fall for so long, and then it just happened at this time, where the Westerners were infiltrating everywhere, at the work of the Westerners, like, hey, it's not a coincidence, and it's obviously self-evident. So sometimes I hate to simply like almost make the same point in the general, especially when talking about Byzantine history, that they, things were sort of much more balanced in favor of the Westerners, because it sounds as if we were talking ill of these poor Byzantine forces. Actually, they had very good military standards, like all cultures in general. Otherwise, they would have not gone at war. They were surely better than the Seljuks. They were better, even more, of course, than the Steppe peoples. But the Westerners had an extra gear. And so you must here have to appreciate the general balance. If you don't, you're just hiding the macroscopical picture. For the rest, it's there is always more to say. In general, there were things that the Byzantines were arguably better at than other peoples. There is a general military tradition that is worth examining. And when we're talking about infantry, when talking about polyursatics, the Byzantines knew their deal, so they could be a dangerous and victorious foe. Just in general, the trend is not simply the same, it's not just in line with a different proportion from the ones we see from this picture. So at large, I would say that we're witnessing an interesting tactics. It also makes sense considering the general conditions that use, of course, the best solutions to circumstances. Even with their limitations, they knew how at some point to turn the tides, but what counts is the average, and of course we have drawn the picture. Very well, we will keep talking about not just Byzantine history, but Byzantine warfare, because again, we made hundreds of videos about Byzantine history, but it's not like you ever end talking about that, right? We just scratched the surface so far, and Schwerpunkt is open to, of course, much more consistent dives into these cultural contexts. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.